Good afternoon and welcome. Today, we delve into a profoundly complex and often contentious issue. Should all recreational drugs be legalized, regulated, and taxed, much like alcohol is currently? This question challenges deeply held beliefs and prompts critical examination of decades of policy. Joining us to dissect this multifaceted topic are two distinguished guests. Mr. Julian Vance, a public health policy advisor, will argue in favor of this proposition. And offering a counter perspective, grounded in extensive experience, is Ms. Isabella Rossi, a former law enforcement chief and prominent social conservative advocate. Our format will consist of opening statements from each speaker, followed by rounds of rebuttal and discussion, concluding with closing remarks. We anticipate a robust, evidence-based exchange on this critical societal matter. Mr. Vance, would you please begin with your opening statement?
Thank you, Dr. Reed. I want to begin by unequivocally acknowledging the gravity and inherent sensitivities surrounding the discussion of psychoactive substances and their place in society. There are genuine risks involved, and no serious proponent of reform ignores them. However, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The global war on drugs, particularly its prohibitionist enforcement model over the past half-century, represents a catastrophic and demonstrable policy failure. Consider the exorbitant financial expenditure, trillions globally, poured into enforcement, interdiction, and incarceration, often with negligible impact on the actual supply or demand for these substances. This is fiscally unsustainable. Beyond the staggering monetary cost, the social consequences have been devastating. We've witnessed the erosion of civil liberties, the fueling of mass incarceration that disproportionately affects marginalized communities, particularly communities of color, and the creation of immense hyper-violent transnational criminal organizations that thrive precisely because of prohibition's artificial price inflation and market control. Therefore, I advocate for a fundamental paradigm shift, moving away from a punitive, criminal justice-centric approach towards a public health framework grounded in harm reduction. Legalization, coupled with stringent regulation, is the cornerstone of this shift. It allows us to implement controls over product purity and potency, drastically mitigating the risks of overdose from dangerously adulterated substances like fentanyl-laced heroin or inaccurately dosed synthetics, risks rampant in the current illicit market. Furthermore, a legal framework enables targeted, credible public health messaging about risks and safer use practices. We can establish and enforce strict age restrictions, something the black market inherently cannot and will not do. Economically, the advantages are compelling. Significant tax revenues can be generated from regulated sales, funds which can be specifically earmarked for vital public services, education, healthcare infrastructure, and, critically, comprehensive addiction treatment and mental health support services. Simultaneously, we would realize vast savings from reduced expenditure on law enforcement, courts, and prisons currently dedicated to pursuing nonviolent drug offenses. Finally, there's a principle of individual liberty at stake. Competent adults in a free society should possess the cognitive liberty and autonomy to make informed choices about their own bodies and consciousness, provided their actions do not directly infringe upon the rights and safety of others. Prohibition represents a profound overreach of state power into personal choice. To be clear, legalization is not an endorsement of drug use. It is, however, the most pragmatic, evidence-informed, and ultimately compassionate strategy to manage the undeniable reality of drug use in society, minimizing its aggregate harms far more effectively than the demonstrably failed policies of the past.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Ms. Rossi, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Mr. Vance articulates concerns about the current system that many of us share: the costs, the illicit market violence, the strain on communities. His intentions to mitigate harm are understandable. However, I fundamentally and vehemently disagree that the proposed solution, the wholesale legalization, regulation, and taxation of all recreational drugs is either appropriate or responsible. It risks exchanging one set of problems for another, potentially far more devastating set. We cannot ignore the inherent dangers associated with many substances currently classified as illicit. Science irrefutably demonstrates the high addictive potential of opioids, the severe neurotoxicity linked to chronic methamphetamine use, and the unpredictable, often dangerous psychological effects of potent hallucinogens and novel synthetic compounds emerging constantly. To legalize these substances is to implicitly signal societal acceptance, inevitably increasing their availability and normalization. This normalization, history suggests, leads directly to increased rates of experimentation, regular use, dependency, and tragically, overdose deaths and severe mental health crises. Mr. Vance speaks of economic benefits, but I urge extreme caution regarding these projections. Any potential tax revenue, I contend, would be utterly dwarfed by the ensuing societal costs. Imagine the amplified burden on our already strained healthcare systems, emergency rooms inundated with overdose victims, the need for vastly expanded long-term addiction treatment facilities, psychiatric services grappling with drug-induced psychoses. Consider the lost economic productivity due to addiction and impairment, the potential rise in drug-related accidents in workplaces and on our roads, and the expansion of social safety nets required to support individuals and families fractured by substance abuse. My gravest concern lies with the impact on our youth and other vulnerable populations. Proponents suggest regulation can control access, but look at the persistent challenges we face with underage alcohol consumption and tobacco use, despite decades of regulation. Are we truly confident we can erect effective barriers against substances far more addictive and impairing, especially when a profit motive drives the legal industry? Widespread legal availability would dramatically increase exposure and access for adolescents, potentially triggering widespread early-onset substance use disorders, with lifelong consequences for brain development and overall well-being. The black market is a problem, yes, but unleashing commercial interests into this sphere is courting disaster. What message are we sending as a society if we legalize substances known to shatter lives, families, and communities? Adding a vast pharmacopoeia of psychoactive drugs to our legal marketplace, alongside the significant public health challenges already posed by alcohol and tobacco, strikes me as an extraordinarily reckless gamble with our collective future. Therefore, while acknowledging the imperfections of the current system and the urgent need for reform, particularly regarding enhanced treatment access, prevention programs, and focusing enforcement on high-level trafficking, maintaining the legal prohibition of these dangerous substances remains a crucial, necessary bulwark against potentially insurmountable public health crises.
Thank you, Ms. Rossi. We now move into our first round of rebuttals. Mr. Vance, you have the opportunity to respond to Ms. Rossi's points.
Thank you. Ms. Rossi paints a grim picture of a potential public health crisis under legalization. But I must respectfully counter that the public health crisis is happening right now, precisely because of prohibition. The current system directly fuels overdose deaths through unknown purity and potency. The fentanyl crisis is a direct consequence of an unregulated illicit market. Prohibition creates barriers to seeking help due to stigma and fear of prosecution, and it prevents us from implementing the very controls Ms. Rossi rightly identifies as necessary. Legalization isn't about unleashing chaos. It's about gaining control. It allows for mandatory product testing, accurate labeling, and the creation of regulated environments where consumers can access substances of known quality. Crucially, the revenue generated provides a dedicated funding stream for the treatment and harm reduction services that are desperately underfunded now. Ms. Rossi warns of catastrophic usage increases, but international examples suggest this isn't an automatic outcome. Portugal decriminalized personal use and invested heavily in health services, resulting in decreased problematic use and overdose deaths. not increases. While distinct from full legalization, it demonstrates a health-led approach yields positive outcomes. Specific regulated markets, like some U.S. states for cannabis, haven't shown the explosion of youth use initially feared, especially when regulations are robust. The key is careful, evidence-based implementation, not blanket fear-mongering. Regarding societal costs, many expenses Ms. Rossi attributes to potential legalization are actually artifacts of prohibition, the immense costs of the criminal justice system, emergency responses to overdoses from unknown street concoctions, treating infectious diseases spread through unsafe practices encouraged by illegality. A regulated market internalizes some risks, but also generates revenue specifically to mitigate them, unlike the current system which only drains resources. And on youth protection, let's be unequivocally clear. The black market dealer has absolutely zero compunction about selling to minors. Indeed, young people are often actively recruited into distribution networks. A licensed, regulated vendor, subject to strict enforcement, inspections, and penalties, including loss of license, provides an imperfect, but demonstrably stronger barrier to youth access than organized crime ever could.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. Ms. Rossi, your rebuttal?
Mr. Vance highlights the failures of the current system, but his proposed solution overlooks critical distinctions and potential consequences. While prohibition is flawed, suggesting it has no suppressive effect on use compared to open commercial availability is simply not credible. Consumption levels of legal substances like alcohol and tobacco, despite regulations, remain vastly higher than those of currently illegal drugs. To assume that legalizing everything from cannabis to heroin and methamphetamine wouldn't lead to significantly increased overall consumption defies logic and historical precedent. Furthermore, citing Portugal's decriminalization model is misleading in a debate about full commercial legalization. Portugal removed criminal penalties for possession, but did not establish a legal, taxed market for production and sale. Comparing that health-focused, non-commercial model to a system potentially involving corporate interests and marketing for all drugs, including the most addictive, is an apples and oranges fallacy. Mr. Vance speaks of quote, harm reduction through regulation. But is it truly the role of the state to facilitate the quote, safer consumption of substances known to be inherently destructive and addictive? I believe this represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the core aims of public health, which should prioritize preventing initiation of use and promoting cessation and recovery, not enabling continued consumption, however quote, regulated. He dismisses concerns about societal costs by labeling current expenses as, quote, artifacts of prohibition. While some costs might shift, the overwhelming evidence from alcohol and tobacco, our longest experiments with legal, regulated drugs, provides a stark cautionary tale. The immense healthcare expenditures, lost productivity, and social harms associated with these legal substances far outweigh any tax revenue they generate. Why would we expect a different outcome with an even wider array of psychoactive chemicals? A profit-driven legal drug industry, like the tobacco and alcohol industries before it, would inevitably prioritize maximizing sales and shareholder value over public health, employing sophisticated marketing and lobbying to increase consumption and fight meaningful regulation, leading to greater net harm.
We've heard compelling arguments highlighting the competing risks, the undeniable harms engendered by the current prohibitionist system versus the potential, perhaps unforeseen, harms of a fully legalized and commercialized one. Ms. Rossi raises significant concerns about the sheer diversity of substances involved. Mr. Vance, you advocate for regulation, but how would such a framework realistically differentiate its approach between substances with vastly different risk profiles, say psilocybin mushrooms compared to illicitly manufactured fentanyl or methamphetamine?
That's a crucial question, Dr. Reed, and Ms. Rossi rightly points out the complexities. A monolithic approach would indeed be inappropriate. The regulatory framework must necessarily be nuanced and tiered, reflecting the specific risks and characteristics of different substances. We already have precedents for such tiered systems. Consider how we regulate pharmaceuticals, over-the-counter medications, alcohol, with varying controls based on potency and type, and tobacco. Different drugs would necessitate different levels of control. For instance, substances with lower risk profiles, like perhaps psilocybin or cannabis, might be available through licensed dispensaries with strict age verification, potency limits, and plain packaging requirements. Substances deemed higher risk, such as opioids or potent stimulants, might only be available through state-controlled outlets or even on a prescription access model initially, with extremely stringent tracking and potentially quantity limits. Yes, designing and implementing such a system is complex. It requires careful consideration of dosage standardization, prevention of diversion to the illicit market, robust quality control, and effective public education. But complexity is not a justification for perpetuating a demonstrably failed and deadly black market. The core point remains: a regulated framework, however challenging to design, offers numerous levers for control, public health intervention, and adaptation based on emerging evidence. Prohibition offers virtually none. It simply cedes the entire market to unregulated, dangerous criminal enterprises. Furthermore, the tax revenue generated isn't just an abstract economic benefit. It's a vital resource. It can fund crucial research into addiction neuroscience, develop more effective treatment modalities, support recovery services, and finance sophisticated, evidence-based public education campaigns about the genuine risks, shifting resources dramatically from punitive enforcement towards genuine care, prevention, and mitigation.
Ms. Rossi, your response to the feasibility and specifics of such a tiered regulatory system?
Mr. Vance speaks of tiered systems and controls, but I believe he significantly underestimates the practical and logistical nightmares involved in regulating such a diverse and potent array of substances simultaneously. How do we scientifically determine, quote, safe dosages for substances whose effects vary wildly between individuals, and whose long-term impacts are, in many cases, poorly understood? How do we effectively prevent diversion from legal channels back into illicit markets, particularly for highly addictive substances with significant street value? How do we navigate complex international treaty obligations concerning narcotics control, which currently underpin global prohibition efforts? And crucially, how do we control the marketing and advertising of potentially highly addictive products without inadvertently encouraging broader use, especially among vulnerable populations? The notion of quote, fully packaging or state-run stores for heroin seems almost surreal, yet that's the territory this proposal leads us into. Beyond these regulatory challenges, we must consider the likely second-order consequences. An increased prevalence of various substance impairments would inevitably impact road safety, workplace productivity, and safety protocols. The normalization of a wider range of drug use could subtly but significantly alter social interactions, community cohesion, and public safety perceptions. Mr. Vance focuses on managing risk, but I fear the proponent's view underestimates the potential scale of the societal shift and the sheer capacity required within our health and social care systems to cope with potentially significant increases in diverse, complex substance use disorders. Are we prepared for that potential reality?
We are nearing the end of our discussion time. We will now proceed to closing statements. Ms. Rossi, please provide your concluding remarks.
Thank you. Throughout this debate, my position has remained firm, grounded in a deep concern for public health and safety. The proposal to legalize, regulate, and tax all recreational drugs, while perhaps well-intentioned, carries unacceptable risks. It risks triggering significant increases in addiction, overdose, and mental illness, particularly threatening our youth. The projected economic benefits are, I believe, illusory, likely to be vastly outweighed by the long-term societal costs to healthcare, productivity, and social services. costs demonstrably associated with currently legal substances. Furthermore, there is a moral hazard in the state sanctioning and potentially profiting from substances known to cause profound harm. Legalizing this vast array of drugs represents a dangerous, irreversible leap into the unknown, abandoning decades of protective measures, however imperfect, for a system fraught with foreseeable and potentially devastating consequences. Therefore, I urge caution and a continued commitment to prioritizing public safety. Let us focus our energies on reforming the current system, enhancing evidence-based prevention, expanding access to compassionate treatment, and targeting enforcement against violent traffickers, rather than dismantling the legal framework that, while needing improvement, still serves as a vital shield.
Thank you, Ms. Rossi. Mr. Vance, your closing statement.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. The core of my argument rests on pragmatism and evidence. We must honestly confront the catastrophic, multi-generational failure of drug prohibition, a policy that has cost countless lives, wasted trillions of dollars, fueled crime and corruption, and disproportionately harmed marginalized communities, all without achieving its stated goals. The alternative I propose, comprehensive legalization, stringent regulation, and taxation, offers tangible benefits: enhanced public safety through product control, reduced crime and violence associated with illicit markets, substantial economic gains through tax revenue and enforcement savings, and the restoration of individual autonomy. The fundamental choice before us is not, realistically, between a drug-free society and one with drugs. It is between continuing to cede control to a dangerous, unregulated criminal market that thrives on prohibition, or implementing a responsible, transparent, and health-focused regulatory system that allows us to manage risks and mitigate harms effectively. This requires a courageous, evidence-based policy shift, moving beyond punitive ideologies towards genuine harm reduction and public health. It is time we learned from the costly mistakes of the past and embraced a more rational, humane, and ultimately safer path forward.
Thank you, Mr. Vance, and thank you, Ms. Rossi, for your articulate, passionate, and deeply considered contributions to this important debate. We have heard two fundamentally divergent perspectives. One advocating for a pragmatic harm reduction approach through legalization and rigorous control, emphasizing the failures of prohibition. The other expressing profound caution, prioritizing prevention, and warning against the inherent risks and potential societal costs of normalization. There are clearly no easy answers. The issue involves intricate ethical considerations, complex legal and regulatory challenges, and significant potential impacts on public health and social fabric. We hope this discussion has provided valuable insights and stimulated further reflection for our audience on this critical issue.